Behind the scene with David Bedein in Jerusalem, Israel, there are ominous developments concerning Israel's peace deal with the United Arab Emirates. While the mainstream media, both in Israel and abroad, are reporting these tremendous business deals that Israel is making between itself and the United Arab Emirates, and the increasing amount of tourists who are now going back and forth between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, you would think that everything would be fine. Well, that's not so. That's only if you look at the superficial, only if you look at business and tourism and the glitter. But there's something else going on. Israel is watching as the United Arab Emirates has become the head of the advisory council to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which oversees the lives of 5 million Palestinian Arabs who live in refugee camps since 1949 under the premise and promise of what's called the right of return. Now, the fact that the United Arab Emirates has become the chairman of the advisory council, which includes 67 nations that pour money into UNRWA, means that they now have a very important role to play in taking the fiduciary responsibility for everything having to do with the UNRWA refugee camps. And this is the reason why Arabs, 5 million Arabs, as I just mentioned before, are confined to refugee camps under what? Under the premise and promise of the right of return by force of arms. That's what keeps them there, and that's what keeps them in the refugee camps. That's what keeps the donations flowing, because they're in a situation of, we say in Hebrew, miskenut, of suffering, of relegated to a lower class status. And the United Arab Emirates, which has signed on a peace deal with Israel that would require the UAE to protest against any possible hints of incitement against the Jewish state, all of a sudden is not expected to do that. No one's asking them to do it. And the war of UNRWA on Israel is expressed in the attacks you see very often from the Gaza Strip onto mainstream Israel, and that is caused by what's called this impotence for the right of return. The idea that they should be returning to where they came from in 1948. That's what's keeping their fires kindled in the UNRWA schools and the UNRWA camps. And this is something which I don't know if many people in Israel had planned for it. Our agency, the Center for Near East Policy, it's now called the Bedein Center for Near East Policy Research, we had predicted that this would happen. Because as Arab children are growing up with pictures of the places they came from in 1948, as if it looks like that today, they are under the illusion, under the impression that they will be allowed to return to the homes, to their thriving villages that existed before 1948. And of course, that's not the case. The war that Israel experienced, which was in a sense a miraculous victory over 7 Arab states, resulted in 5 million. Now it's 5 million Arab refugees. At that time, it was a lot less. And the fact that the UNRWA budget is being used in the UNRWA camps for a school system that promotes war against the Jews, and the fact that Abu Dhabi, also known as the United Arab Emirates, is the 5th largest contributor to that system, that is a formula for war in the future, not only between UNRWA and Israel, but also between the Arab states that are and the Western states that are supporting UNRWA against Israel. One of whom, the leading donor, of course, is Germany, since the United States pulled its funding out of UNRWA on August 31st, 2018. The nation that has, in a sense, called up the mantle and decided they would be the successors of the U.S. in terms of aid, that's Germany. There's other countries also coming into play. As I mentioned before, Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates, giving 14 million how much they're giving. Let me take a look. Yes, 52 million, and the German government giving 177 million. Now, Israel has its own economic and diplomatic relations, both with the United Arab Emirates and with Germany. The question is, will Israel have speak from its integrity and object to the foreign nations giving basically a lethal product, a lethal aid to UNRWA, which they're going to turn around and transform their children into fighters against Israel and for UNRWA, because they're not only asking for a piece of territory, they're asking to replace Israel with the Palestinian Arab state. So this, you can see our new website at UNRWA Monitor, UNRWA dash monitor period com, UNRWA dash monitor period com. You'll see exactly what we're talking about those who are training their children for the long term in making a war against Israel under the specious idea, the specious slogan of the right of return by force of arms. So there you have it, a very ominous developments vis-a-vis UNRWA in the past week, and we shall see what's going to be. But I must mention also that today, December 9th, 2020, is the 71st anniversary of UNRWA and of its functioning as an agency which keeps people in refugee camps for perpetuity, because there's no chance that they're going to go back to where they came from. And there's no chance that Israel at this point would allow them to come back, because according to Resolution 194, which created UNRWA, any return would have to be within the framework of peace. And UNRWA shows no signs of any kind of a peace posture. This is David Bedein reporting. Behind the Scene with David Bedein. Thank you for listening.